excited to be here. I am now going to share my screen, and just give me 1 second for the technical changeover. Okay. All right. So we're talking today about resolutions in ruins, and I think we both can promise that this won't be a doom and gloom conversation. We want to come up with a catchy title, but we hope that you'll leave with some actionable strategies around goal setting. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. And as Jolie said, please do feel free to put questions in the Q&A because we are going to get to those. And we also have some questions already, so we're excited to answer them. Okay. So, whoops, already technical. Okay, here we go. So why are we talking about resolutions? It's February, so I think a lot of us will make some resolutions or make some big statement about a goal we want to set and keep, and we often make them. I started looking at some research, and it was hard to find an exact percentage of the number of people that make resolutions, but it's a good number. And oftentimes the resolutions might be something related to self-improvement, like I want to exercise more, I want to eat more healthily, but obviously can be lots of other things as well. And I think one of the reasons I was interested in talking about this, and Paul and I started talking about this, is because oftentimes people will set really lovely intentions with a resolution and then experience some frustration when a resolution that's been set isn't met to the level that the person was hoping. And then that decreased motivation can sometimes lead to sort of rejecting the resolution altogether. So, or sort of abandoning the resolution. And we want to, I certainly have done this before, so we want to help sort of correct the notion of what a resolution is and talk about just being a little bit more planful. Okay. So some people might have seen this acronym before. I know I've seen it a lot in education or when I've worked with schools around setting goals for IEPs and 504 accommodations. And I will invite people to think about setting SMART goals. Yes, they're SMART because we want you to think about it in a smart way, but with the acronym of setting specific, so being as specific as possible, setting a goal that's measurable, right? So what is it gonna, what does it look like? How are you gonna know you're meeting it? That it's attainable so that it's within the realm of possibility, that it's relevant, right? It's relevant to your values, it's relevant to this time and place to you, and that it's time bound. So setting a resolution for a year is nice, and that's a really long period of time. So I'm not going to go too much more into the acronym because I'm going to come back to it in a few minutes, but I'm going to turn this over to you, Paul, as you talk about willpower.
Sure, thank you. And I'm glad we're talking about SMART goals. It's really one of the most important concepts I think that we'll hit on today. That acronym packs a lot of useful information into 5 letters there. But what I wanted to talk about next is willpower, because when people talk usually about their ability to implement a New Year's resolution, they talk about willpower. But what we know from research and everything that decades and decades of behavior modification research has taught us is that willpower is kind of an overrated concept. You know, when we try to change our behavior, that's really a skill, changing behavior. It's not just a trait that we either have or we don't. Some people think, well, I do have enough willpower or I don't, like it's some innate ability, like being, I don't know, double jointed or something. But the reality is a lot more complicated. I guess one way to think about it would be this. If willpower was the only reason that we succeeded or failed at implementing New Year's resolutions, then it wouldn't really matter if we were tired or stressed or busy when we tried to do things like eat healthy or exercise or quit smoking or what have you. We would just meet our resolutions goals regardless. But it definitely does matter. So with that in mind, we should probably start to think a little bit about what are some of these nuances that can really impact whether we have success or not with implementing New Year's resolutions. So maybe we can look at the next slide here and we'll get more into the nitty gritty of some of the important concepts here. So when it comes to trying to change behaviors, it's going to be very important to really be aware of what precedes the behavior that we're trying to implement. And I'm going to use the phrase, and maybe Rachel will too, of target behavior. So let me just explain what that means. If we're trying to stop smoking, for example, and that's your New Year's resolution, and the target behavior is going to be the smoking. And in this case, we're trying to eliminate it. But sometimes we're trying to add a behavior like, I don't know, eating more vegetables. And eating a vegetable would be the target behavior in that case. So if you hear me use that term, that's really how I mean it. So we want to be very aware of what comes before the target behavior. So here's some examples on the slides here. Let's say you notice that as you're trying to implement your New Year's resolution about exercise, you're more likely to actually do it when you've slept for more than 7 hours. Or here's another example. You're more likely to eat red meat, which let's say your resolution is to try to cut back. You're more likely to do that if you go to one restaurant than if you go to another one. So these are actually important factors that typically we already know about ourselves that we can really try to use to our advantage as we try to change our behavior. So we want to be very aware of that. And when we look at the behavior itself, like smoking, for example, we want to try to make it either more difficult to do in the case of smoking or easier to do if it's vegetable. So this is the logic behind doing things like if you want to eat healthy, make sure that food is prominently displayed in your kitchen, very accessible. Or if it's something like smoking or drinking alcohol that you want to do less of, you want to make those behaviors less accessible and harder to do. So that might mean moving them physically. It could mean making some other changes in your life. But those are some other principles that it's helpful to keep in mind. And then on the bottom half of this slide, it says what consequences follow the behavior. So this one can be a little bit more complicated, I suppose, but it's helpful to understand how you feel after you do the behavior. So after you eat vegetables, do you feel better? Maybe not. I don't know, but it's important to think about that. After you smoke a cigarette, do you feel better? Well, probably the answer is yes, or else you wouldn't have gotten addicted to them in the first place. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it's a good idea for you, but it's important to recognize what the impact is of the behavior. So some examples that we've included here, the first two are about somebody who wants to interact with their friends more. Because, you know, this is the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. So if you want to improve your mental health, one thing you might try to do is to improve your social interactions. So let's say you notice that when you talk to one friend, you feel drained afterwards, but when you talk to a different friend, you feel happy afterwards. I think we've all had these kind of experiences. So it's important to really take into account what the feelings are that follow the target behavior. Now, the other examples on here are if you have a drink or smoke a cigarette, some people may feel more calm afterwards. This is important to keep in mind because you're going to want to think about what else can I do to get a similar kind of feeling? Maybe not exactly the same, but similar in that situation so I don't feel as reliant on cigarettes or alcohol, for example. Or here's another kind of negative consequence. After you exercise, some people feel invigorated, some people feel tired. It might depend on how much exercise you do, but it's important to keep that in mind so we can try to engineer the situations we put ourselves in to maximize the chances that we're going to have success changing our behavior.
Yep.
So
And
go
before
ahead,
we go to the
Rachel.
next slide, I was just thinking, you know, you were saying we probably all know what precedes a behavior, right? And I was just looking at that first bullet that says you're more likely to exercise, let's say when you've had over 7 hours of sleep. If you know that about yourself, and yet you've set a goal to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to exercise, and yet you're going to end up being really tired, that would be an important variable to take into account when setting that goal. Because if you're someone who needs your sleep before you exercise, you're probably going to come up against sort of a barrier there. So having that information and knowing that about yourself is going to help you in setting the goal. Okay.
Exactly. And one thing, if I could make one more
Yep.
point here, that it might lead you toward is if you recognize that you're always getting 6 hours of sleep and you never exercise in that example, then it could be that a better goal for you, a smarter goal, if you will, would be to work on getting more sleep. So it can be helpful in that way.
Absolutely. And again, that SMART acronym on one hand might seem really a little bit basic, like, guys, is this really rocket science? And I think so many of us will say things like, maybe our goal, I want to get more exercise, right? And like, I think that sounds like a really great goal. And if someone said to me, my goal is to get more exercise, and Yes, we're psychologists, so we love to ask questions, but I don't know what get more exercise looks like. I don't know when you'll achieve that goal, and I don't know that you do. What exactly does it look like? And so using SMART as a model, we want to be really specific in setting our intentions. And even just in doing that, maybe the person says, well, I want to exercise 6 out of 7 times a week for 90 minutes. And you're someone who maybe really doesn't exercise at all. My first thought would be like, wow, that's setting a pretty high bar, right? Like going from not really exercising at all or exercising very inconsistently to exercising 6 out of 7 or 7 out of 7 weeks for 90 minutes. I don't know about everybody else who's on the call, but for me, that seems like setting the bar really high. And invariably, it's going to be really easy to not meet that goal right away. So sometimes setting a very specific, smaller goal that also we all do well. Kids do well with positive reinforcement and praise and feeling good about things, and so do adults. So if, for example, we say, I'm going to exercise 3 times a week, doing some level of cardiovascular activity, I'm going to get my heart rate up for 30 minutes over the next 6 months. That might sound like 30 minutes, 3 times a week. We should be doing more. And it's a great place to start. And then we want to ask ourselves, well, first of all, is it measurable? Yes, I could measure the absence or presence of that behavior. Yes, for sure. Did I do 30 minutes? No, I did 25 or I did 0. Is it attainable? I'd have to ask myself, is it possible for me to exercise 3 times a week for that amount of time? Right? I think that's really important. And I'll just give a slight personal example. I remember I used to like to take this one exercise class, but it took about 20 minutes to get there and obviously 20 minutes to get home. And it was a great class, but it was a 90-minute class and sometimes a 75-minute class, but often 90. And it ended up being something I enjoyed, but it wasn't super attainable because it just wasn't something that I could sustain with some of my other responsibilities. And so being able to assess, like, do I have the time? Do I have the space? Or do I have a place to walk or run, et cetera? Is it relevant? So is exercising 3 times a week for 30 minutes over the next 6 months in line with what's important to me? Is that a priority for me? Maybe to be around long term for my family by engaging in behaviors that are healthy or engaging in self care. It has to be relevant to you, not because you heard on TikTok or Instagram or read an article that said you should do this. And then I will come back to this, but I do think it's really helpful to keep track of what you have done. I think all of us have faulty memories. And sometimes we think back, how did I do over the last week? And maybe we think, oh, Monday, yeah, I think I exercised. So there are lots of ways, and I think I talk about it in a minute, about how to track things. But keeping track can be really helpful so that you actually know how it's going. So I'm going to turn it to Paul for a second.
I wanted to offer some general tips that are going to be very consistent with what Rachel was just talking about. She was saying to be realistic, as the acronym SMART suggests, in terms of what goals we have for ourselves. My first point here on this slide is to allow for gradual change. So if you want to get yourself to a point where you're exercising 6 times a week for 90 minutes, that's great. But if you try to go from exercising 0 times a week to that, you may be in for some unpleasant surprises. So it's good to allow for gradual change in the sense that sometimes if you work towards exercising 6 times a week, and that's your resolution even from the beginning, you're going to have some weeks when you only do 4 or only do 2 or only do 0. But since you've set this kind of resolution and intention and you're continuing to work on making this change, being patient with that process and being happy with incremental improvements is, I think, a real important tool. And it's one of the things that's going to keep you in the game. It's going to keep you from getting demoralized and giving up. And that's obviously important. All right, now, again, reiterating something that Rachel said a moment ago, tracking the behavior you're trying to change is, I think, another one of the most important things that you're going to hear from us today. Everything we know about how to change behavior suggests that keeping track of how well you do or how poorly you do on a day-to-day basis is very important for that process, whether it's exercise, smoking, alcohol, talking to more friends, anything that you're trying to change. Tracking it is going to enable you to, number one, hold yourself accountable to yourself. But number two, it's going to enable you to look back and see, on Tuesday, was I able to meet my goal? And if so, great. What helped me accomplish that? And if not, what got in the way? And to do a little bit of what's that called? Quality assurance? Or
Yeah,
I don't know exactly.
quality or performance improvement or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. So, related to tracking your behavior, I'm also going to suggest that you track what comes before the behavior and what comes after. So let's take Rachel's exercise example. Let's say what comes before the behavior is a 20-minute trip to the gym. Now, maybe you really enjoy that trip to the gym because it's a chance for you to kind of just relax and get yourself in the right headspace for exercise. Or maybe you find it a really annoying commute that's full of traffic. Um, Noting that on your tracking sheet or app, whatever you're using, is going to be important, as well as the consequences. Did you feel better? Did it help you get more done that day? Did you feel better about your health, perhaps overall? Those things are going to be important and will help that kind of quality assurance work that you're doing with yourself as you look back on how well you've done. And finally, and consistent with what we've been saying thus far, you want to anticipate obstacles are going to come up. You know, if it was that easy to go from no exercise to 6 days a week, you wouldn't be watching this webinar, and we would all be in great shape and super healthy and have fabulous lives. So if you can anticipate what those problems are likely to be, you're going to be one step ahead of the game. I would recommend, on the sheet that you're using to track your behaviors, write out at the top 5 obstacles you anticipate you are going to encounter, and then write out just one quick sentence about what you're going to do about it, how you're going to address
I think that's great. And just again, not to hammer in the methods of tracking and accountability, but as Paul was talking, I opened up my phone and I went into the App Store, and of course, tons of habit tracker apps, right? And so you might be someone who's a digital person who really does not like to have paper around, and you can digitally just track the presence or absence of a variety of behaviors. Glasses of water you drank, if you exercised or not. I actually like things on paper. So if you're a Pinterest person like I am and you put in printable and free, because those are the ones I like, habit trackers, there are lots of really cute ones where you can color in the little boxes. I strangely or cutely like to see the little squares add up. It's kind of satisfying to see the progress. And so you're able to really like map it out. And again, as Paul was saying, it's about accountability, right? And then seeing when things get in the way. I think it's also really nice in those moments where maybe we're feeling like, oh, I was really busy, or, maybe when I go to Las Vegas for the ADAA conference, I'm not going to have time to engage in some other behaviors. And maybe I'm feeling kind of bad. Oh, I didn't go to my this class or that class. But then I start to sometimes get a little down and say, oh, see, I'm not meeting my goal. But if I look at my habit tracker, I would see, wait, Rachel, hold on, there's a little distortion there. You actually have been meeting your goal. You're just remembering these 4 days you were in Vegas. Maybe you ate a little bit more, indulgently, or stayed up later. So I really like putting it on a calendar or having a tracker. I also think, and I'm curious, Paul, what you think. I think telling someone else, a friend, a family member, or a coworker about a commitment you made is really nice. Then the person might say, "Hey, Paul, I remember you've been going to the gym, you've been walking on the treadmill, or you're into like taking long bike rides or walking your dog. How's that going?" Right? So people can be, it's a way to also connect you. Sometimes you might have an accountability partner. So I might say to my sister, like, hey, Sarah, like, what's something you're working on? Great. How about twice a week we check in with each other and in just a really non-judgmental way say, how's it going? How's it going, filling that water bottle 2 times a day? Or how's it going making sure to take a movement break between after you've been sitting for a really long time? So I actually think that's a really nice way to hold yourself accountable and also connect to someone else, because we know that activation and engaging is really good for our mood. And I think that is the last of our slides. So we're going to unshare for a second. I think I'll say one more thing as we're getting ready to answer questions, which is the idea of rewards. And I don't know, Paul, what you think about this. Sometimes the reward is just in the behavior itself, right? I drink more water. I'm filling my water bottle twice a day during the workday every day. I actually feel more hydrated. I feel like I have energy, or maybe I'm eating more healthily. So I just feel good. And that in and of itself is a reward. And sometimes some of these things that we're wanting to do are actually not kind of challenging. And so we might say to add an extra incentive, like I am going to engage in this behavior. And after a month, I'm going to assess how it's going. And then I'm going to reward myself by doing something with friends, or going to, a movie, or getting my nails done, or having, brunch with my two close friends. And I don't think that's a hokey way. I think that actually helps us stay really focused and reward ourselves for things that are, to be honest, really challenging. Um,
Yeah, I would definitely echo that, and would point out that there's a couple different ways that we can reward ourselves after we're implementing a change that we'd like to see. One is, after a month, if it's going well, and I would personally, I'd encourage people to define ahead of time what it means to have success that would trigger the reward, to do something nice for ourselves, like Rachel said, brunch with a friend. But another principle that you can use here, well, I guess it's the same principle, but another way to implement it would be to have a reward right after the target behavior. So if you eat a vegetable, then there's some kind of reward that happens. Now, you want it to be small, and you want it to not undo the good that you've done with your target behavior that you've just performed. Like, one example that sticks in my mind that I read about this once is in a book that I actually do recommend, called Atomic Habits, by, I think the guy's name is James Clear. He cites this example of a guy in Europe somewhere who really enjoyed watching Netflix, but wanted to get more exercise. So he was some kind of tech whiz, and he rigged up his stationary bike so that he could only watch Netflix while he was pedaling the bicycle over a certain speed. So he was rewarded for performing the target behavior uh, instantly. So, I mean, it's kind of brilliant. Now, we don't all have the capacity to do that, but you get the idea that if you can reward yourself for something that you'd like to see yourself do on a more frequent basis, and ideally only have that reward happen after you perform the target behavior, then
yeah,
you're really cooking.
I love it. Paul, you already have some questions ready to go that were submitted in advance. Do you mind reading some of those or answering some?
Yes. Well, I'm going to read them and we'll decide
We'll
how
figure
we
out.
want to
Okay,
tackle
sounds
them.
good.
So the first one is kind of self-explanatory. It says, how to avoid sadness over failure again. So I guess this
Mm,
somebody has tried repeatedly and not done so well with trying to implement behavior change. How can they avoid sadness over that?
yeah. Well, I think the first thing, and I imagine we might answer this differently. I think the first thing I would say is, what's the sadness about? Is it feeling like, but again, like just asking, what am I specifically sad about? And then I think if someone's saying again, it sounds like maybe this is not the first time. And then I'd kind of go back to what is getting in my way? Like really, sometimes just writing down like what is getting in my way. It might be time. And then if I were sitting with the person, I might say, okay, be more specific. Like, what do you mean? Like, I'm trying to do this thing or not do this thing at a specific time of day, and that's not working out so well. Or this is too expensive, the thing that I want to do. Like, I wanted to join a gym, or I wanted to travel more, and it's not in my budget right now. And then what would be a slightly smaller goal? I think I'd really try, just like when we think about exposures, doing things that are hard, what would I do if I was going to start, or I was going to tell my best friend, because we're often kinder to our best friends than we are sometimes to ourselves. What would I tell them to start with, just to take one step in the right direction? So that's probably how I'd answer that question to start with.
Yeah, I think my answer would be pretty similar, in that what I would suggest is, don't give up. If it hasn't worked out, well, let's troubleshoot on exactly what's gone wrong, and using some of the principles we've talked about thus far today, how might we be able to tweak your efforts so that they're more likely to meet with success and less sadness?
Mhm. Yes, for sure. That was a good question.
Yeah. So let's move on to the next one here that we've received before the webinar. All right, so this person asks how to tackle email volume overwhelm, how to tackle papers piling up on desk,
Oh,
how to get rid of clothes not being worn regularly.
boy, I'm looking at my desk while you're reading that and getting very distracted. Do you have a thought? Do you want to start that one,
Uh,
Paul?
sure, yeah. Well, my thought about this one is that these are three different problems. I mean, I know they seem related, but if we're going to really try to maximize our odds of success at improving any or all of these difficulties, we want to divide and conquer. So let's take them one at a time. So if, let's say, email volume overwhelm, that's something that I think a lot of us can relate to. I think using the SMART goals framework is going to be very realistic here. And, you might set a goal for yourself to go through emails, let's say, for 5 minutes a day at 10 a.m. every weekday, for the foreseeable future. So it's there's a plan, and if there's actually another term we haven't introduced yet called an implementation intention that can be very useful if you're writing down or telling someone at 10 o'clock for 5 minutes, I'm going to sort through old emails and either delete them or archive them or answer them. There's something powerful that happens when we write that down or speak it into existence rather than just thinking it. So I would definitely recommend that tip. But I don't know if you had any other thoughts about that question,
No,
Rachel.
I think that was a really good one. I'm going to write this down in the chat for people. I like this idea of, again, like saying it, just thinking, like saying it or writing it down really does make it more real. Just like saying to Paul, hey, Paul, I've committed to clearing out my inbox and I'm going to start by doing it in this way, kind of makes it a little bit more real. Now, is Paul going to come over to my house or to my email and stand over me? No, but it does make it a little more real. I did see a question pop in the chat that I thought we could answer before we get to the other questions, if that's okay. Because this is a really good question. It says, what if the client's goal or someone's goal is related to finding a life partner, which may not be entirely in their control? And I just think that's a really excellent question. And so I do think like that, if I was, and it says client, so if I was working with a client, I think I'd probably, or just helping anyone, I'd say, yeah, for sure, there are some variables that are not in our control, right? Like I can't control the fish in the sea. I cannot control all available life partners. But, and I think this goes back to, like, Paul, what you were saying about being social or engaging more, like what are behaviors or what are things that are going to get me in a space where my goal would be more likely to be achieved, right? So if, for example, someone's really overwhelmed or thinking like, how am I going to meet the right person, and has a lot of thoughts related to that, and that actually leads to spending more time at home or spending more time alone, I probably would want to identify, well, what are some ways to just get out and be social? Even if it's not necessarily focused specifically on dating, although it might be, but it might be like, I'm going to do things in my town. I'm going to join a particular club. If I go to a gym rather than work out alone, I'm maybe going to take a class that they offer or something in a church or temple. Like, I think really trying to see what the value is, right? And then like live toward the values and do the things that are in my control. Right? If someone says, hey, I got someone nice I want you to meet, I'm going to go against my inclination to maybe say no and say, yeah, that sounds great. Paul, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I mean, this is an excellent question, and I definitely agree with everything you're saying. It reminds me of the example we were talking about a little while ago about that you're more likely to exercise when you've gotten 7 hours of sleep. Well, what we have there is a situation where the desired outcome is dependent on a different kind of choice that we need to make, if possible, that will lead us to the desired outcome. So you're absolutely right. You can't just will yourself into finding a life partner instantly, but as you said, we can have some impact over the things that we do that make us more likely to meet someone.
Right. Yeah.
So sometimes we need to target those behaviors and not the one that we're really thinking about.
That's true. That's true. Here's another, I think we got a really good group here because there's another question coming in that says, how do you tackle the problem of overthinking and underachieving, self-blame, and unproductive and absence of self-esteem? So that, like the other question, I think there are a bunch of questions in there. And so I'm going to tackle one, and then maybe Paul, you want to tackle another, right? So let's say
Sure.
you have, I love overthinking. I love anxiety. So I like overthinking, right? And sometimes when I find myself, or if I'm working with someone, or if I had a friend that was like really overthinking a particular thing, like let's go back to the finding the life partner, and they're saying like, but I want to be social, but like how should I do that? Should I join a club, or should I go with my friend to, a book club, or should I do this or should I do that? I'd probably say, all right, I'm going to give myself, 30 seconds to make a decision unless it's life or death. Like I wouldn't tell someone 30 seconds to decide what car they're going to buy. But if it's a matter of like, should I go to this event or that event? Or should I take a group exercise class? And would cycling be better or would this be better? I'd say the answer is yes. Just go ahead and make the decision. Knowing that actually, to Paul's point, what we're targeting is actually the overthinking first versus the actual like let's say be more social, because we're not going to be social if we just stay in a place of circling around the decision itself. So I'd probably say, it'd be good practice making fast decisions without overthinking, which might mean like practicing making some quick decisions, or rolling a die when I have an array of options to do. So that's my one answer for overthinking. But I'm wondering, Paul, do you want to take underachieving or self-blame or unproductivity or absence of self-esteem? These are all really good questions.
It's quite a rich list there. I mean, the way that I heard it, and I have no idea if this is how the person meant it, they talked about what were the first two?
Yep. How do you
Overthinking and
tackle the problem of
underachieving?
overthinking and underachieve?
Okay. So
Self-blame
I
and
wonder if I had wondered if maybe they meant those as kind of a pair.
yeah,
Overthinking and
that's true.
underachieving is if they spend too much time thinking about reaching a goal from a New Year's resolution and it doesn't actually happen.
Yep.
Well, in that case, I would recommend just looking at the behavioral steps that we've talked about here today, because if we can fix the underachieving part, the overthinking might cease to be an issue.
Mhm.
But, a lot of people have difficulties with overthinking that have relatively little to do, as Rachel was suggesting, with New Year's resolution. They're just chronic overthinkers, and there are psychological ways to help folks like that that go a little bit beyond the scope of New Year's resolutions. But and similarly, I think low self-esteem was on the list of four or five
Low
things as well.
self-esteem and self-blame and self-blame.
Yeah. For low self-esteem, if you wanted to address that with a behavioral resolution or a New Year's resolution for yourself, I think it's going to force you to sit back and think, what is it that I could do that's going to help me feel better about myself? And I happen to think that's a very intelligent approach to take to addressing that issue. I'm not saying it's going to solve 100% of your self-esteem issues, but it's going to potentially be quite helpful.
Mhm. Yeah. These are some really great questions that are popping in. I think we can take one of your questions, Paul,
Yeah.
that you have in the list.
Okay. So here's a good one. This person says, my trouble is follow through. I start off good, and after a while, something gets in the way, and I get interrupted, but never get back to what I was doing. Life gets too busy and goes in another direction. How do I keep on track or minimize the changes?
Mhm. Such a good question. I do think that the having a tracker or having a mechanism of tracking can sometimes help, because then you'll see the pattern soon. So we start in January, first 2 weeks of January are awesome. And then maybe we have a long weekend and something happens, and then we just like don't start up again. It could be keeping that tracker kind of front and center. I put a calendar in my bathroom for things that are important that I need to keep remembering. My husband's like, I have it in my phone. And I'm like, I need it in front of me, right? So I like it in front of me. It could be that you decide, maybe you set a reminder in your phone that every Sunday night or every Monday morning, that's your check-in about my goal. How's it going? Do I need to recommit?
Yeah,
Do I need to reset my intention? And again, like to the point of self-blame, hey, lots of people struggle with this. That there was a whole webinar on it. There are books on this, so I can't be the only one. And recommitting on Sunday night or Monday, that's going to help me. Like, what's my intention this week? Paul, were you going to add something?
yeah. I was just going to emphasize the utility of calendar reminders, which didn't exist necessarily 20 years ago, but now we can program calendars if we use electronic ones to remind us. Let's say every Sunday night,
Mhm.
the reminder can just be, how are you doing with your smoking cessation efforts? How are you doing with your calorie counting or whatever it might be? And it's just going to kind of force us to think about it, and it can be a cue that helps trigger our getting back on track with using whatever kind of either app or behavioral efforts that we need to focus on.
Totally. And that just reminded me with your reminders that we may find And maybe we're in a period of time where things are going fairly well. There aren't a whole lot of other stressors. And we're like, hey, I didn't even need my reminder. I reset my intention on my own. There might be other times where we notice, oh, I'm glad I had that reminder because there's a lot going on. And then we can actually say, well, what is going on? Oh, well, now that I think about it, there's some stuff going on in my family. My sleep hasn't been so great, or my kid was sick. And then we'd go, oh, well, of course that would be harder. And I just think that that's, definitely a helpful way to think about it. Okay. I see, we have a question coming in the Q&A, but why don't you go ahead and keep reading and I'll take a look at that one too.
Okay, sure. So the next question here says, I set a goal to be kinder to others, but I kind of forgot about it after a week or two. Where did I go wrong? So I can take a stab at this
Sure.
one. So if this person wants to be kinder to others, well, the first thing that stands out to me is, I think that's an excellent goal. And second of all, remember the M in SMART stands for measurable, I'm pretty sure, right, Rachel?
Measurable.
Okay. Yeah. So we want to really try to better define how are you going to try to be kinder to others? Because that's a little bit abstract. I mean, there's a lot of ways to do that, but we would rather have you have something that's easier to kind of check off whether you accomplished it or not on a given day. For example, let's say you want to say something nice to a stranger every day. Let's say that's your goal. That's your way of implementing kindness. Well, it's going to be easier for us to determine whether you've met that goal for the day or not. And then we can start to think about why and what consequences it had as well. But I think defining what you're going for a little bit more cleanly can help.
Mhm, totally. Here's a question that's in the Q&A. So, therapist with an OCD friend I know has overthinking and underachieving challenge with documentation and emails. New Year's goal was to take a break from documentation when OCD kicks in, but only delays notes getting done. So, if I'm reading this correctly, and Paul, I can read it again, but what I'm reading is that there was that OCD, which I think can sometimes really cloud things, right? Obviously can add to overthinking and make things really challenging, especially when there's perfectionism. So a goal was to take a break from documentation when OCD kicks in. So I could understand that inclination. And at the same time, it delays notes getting done. So in some ways, it doesn't eliminate the problem because the work still needs to get done, right? And so and I don't know if this is the right answer, but I wonder if, maybe a slightly tweaked goal might not be taking break from documentation, but maybe working on sort of like what I was saying before, doing things a little bit more quickly, right? So maybe setting a timer around how much time we'll spend engaging in the documentation. Um, and again, this is a little bit trickier because this is a treatment related thing. So I'm hesitant to go longer, but I sometimes think it's a good point in saying, like, was my goal actually working toward what I wanted, or is it actually creating a new challenge? And if it is, then it might mean we need to sort of tweak a little bit. So definitely challenging on that one. Do
Yeah,
we have
and
another question? Do you have one, Paul?
sure. Let's see here. So the next question that I have on my list here is it really possible to lose weight via a New Year's resolution if I can't do it the rest of the year?
Well,
So I
yeah,
can
what do
take a
you
stab
think?
at this one first.
Yeah, great.
Uh, Well, I think the first thing I would say is yes, if you're willing to engage in different behaviors now than you are the rest of the year, absolutely. Um, I think it's a little bit tempting to kind of throw out the baby with the bathwater in these kind of situations and think, well, I've tried 5 times, but it hasn't worked, so it's not worth trying again. Well, I know research on people who try to quit smoking suggests that the more you try, the more likely you are to succeed going forward. So, getting demoralized isn't always quite warranted by the facts of the situation. So, if when it comes to losing weight, again, kind of like a couple examples we were talking about previously, I would encourage someone to focus on the behaviors that lead to weight loss or weight gain. So whether that's what you're eating, how much you're exercising, whatever you decide to focus on, if you focus on that in the SMART goal kind of framework, then I think there's no reason you might not be able to have success there.
Yeah. I think that sounds great.
So I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions.
Great. The voice from Julie. Yes.
Thank you, Jolie. Did you
bet.
have one, Rachel, or should I
No,
give you
I
another
want
one
to
from
keep
mine?
going.
Okay. So let's see. I have one more here,
Great.
which says, can you offer guidance on how to set goals or resolutions as a family? How do we include kids?
Love that question. I think setting goals as a family, it has benefit for a couple reasons. I think when kids are great imitators, right? So we want to give them good stuff to imitate. So I think when kids see us setting intentional goals, and sharing, I mean, of course, appropriately, our success and also some of our challenge, I think it allows kids to see us as full humans with all of the things that are great and foibles, and how I recalibrate a goal if I need to. I also think that it's really a nice idea to set a goal as a family, maybe to say we're all going to put our devices in a specific spot during meal times, or we're going to play more board games as a family, or we're going to rotate who gets to pick a family activity every weekend day, right? And I do think it, again, built in accountability partners. And I think kids are also really good at saying like, hey, mom, we were supposed to do this thing and we didn't do it. So, hey, we got to remember to do that thing. Or it's my turn to pick the family movie. And hey, you know what, Jackson, I'm really glad you reminded me, because without everybody reminding each other, we might forget. So I think it helps kids. Also, maybe your child says, I'm going to do this thing, and it's something that you're like, wow, that might take a couple years to get there. Then it gives you an opportunity to say, hey, Paul, that sounds like a really great goal. And I think that goal is going to take a really long time to achieve because you don't know yet how to ski, or you've never gone snowboarding. Let's figure out a small goal first. So I like that goal.
So it looks like we
Always
have
nice to have.
one. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just was pointing out we've got one new question I think we could wrap up with in our Q&A.
Yep. And I can read that one. With many priorities A to Z, I've been struggling to achieve priority A. What would be a good strategy so that I can get back to priority A while others also matter? Because of this struggle, I've been feeling depressed and disappointed. I think that's a good goal. So or a question, if I understand it, we got a lot of priorities. All of us have A to Z, right? And then when we focus on B and C and D and E, we forget about priority A, right? That's how I read it. Paul, do you want me to take it first, or you want to go?
Well, I'll say it's a little bit hard to know how to advise this person without really knowing what these priorities are. But I'm going to think about that for a moment.
Okay.
But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's also true. So I don't want to be dismissive of not knowing the context, but I think what I would say is if priority A is really important to me, and so are B to Z, I might set a really specific intention, almost like the reading the inbox every day at X time. I might actually carve out a very dedicated time to whether it's actually work on that goal or just think about that goal, just because I don't know what that priority A is, but say this is just so important and I start to feel really bad when it falls by the wayside, that I'm going to carve out these times to make sure I'm attending to it in some way. And again, I think I'm not sure exactly what it is, but that's what I would say. I'd say, you know what, this is just too important of a priority. So I'm going to make sure that on these days or this frequency, I'm making sure to give it a little bit of time. And I think I'd also deprioritize the idea that it has to be done to perfection, but that I'm setting my intention to work toward it. And because, like any other person, I have 25 other priorities, I'm going to do the best I can while taking into account life. Paul, I don't know if you would add anything. Oh, here comes Jolie.
I would say that self-compassion is important in those situations too. Just real quick, if you don't have time to do everything that you'd ideally like to do, it's important to give yourself a break and acknowledge the constraints of the situation you're in.